Good morning, everyone. I thought I wanted to say a few words in view of SAF Day. I would start my remarks by saying that if you ask most Singaporeans, and especially also foreign military observers, everyone would agree that SAF has come a long way. We started out 46 years ago, and today, if you ask military analysts, people who watch how militaries progress, how they develop, and the military industry is a complex one. It's about what you buy, your procurement, how you use it, how you train your men. In essence, it's actually a very complex organization because there are so many functions, and we'll talk about that. But if you ask these analysts, and I would just want to quote from one Jane Defence, for example, they would say that we're among, quote unquote, among the best trained and technologically capable in Asia. I'll circulate the notes after I've spoken to them so you can refer to it. And I think many would agree with them from our military to military interactions that our various servicemen have with their counterparts. They get the same sense. We want to be careful that it doesn't go to our heads, but at the same time it's a very good affirmation and assurance that what we have today is considered to be among, as they say, the best trained and technological capable in Asia. And we have a very highly networked, capable force, able to really to respond to a wide spectrum of operations. So if you look at the last decade, in our many humanitarian assistance, defense, relief operations, as well as our deployments in Afghanistan and to support international efforts, just the use of our, whether it's our frigates, our Super Pumas, our Chinooks, our KC-135s, our transport planes, our weapon locating radars. It was different terrain. You were either operating in the coast of Aceh, where you're at sea level, and after a tsunami, your charts are completely changed, and you can be operating in Bamiyan, cold terrain, very primitive, in Afghanistan, in Oruzgan. You can be operating in very different and complex environment. And all off the coast of Somalia, Gulf of Aden, you're operating in very different terrain, many thousand miles away. The SAF has responded to each, and sometimes we almost take it a little bit for granted, but it's actually a very complex exercise. So I think we've done well, and I would say that the rapid progress from where we started 46 years ago, and when we started out, we had 2 infantry battalions, 50 officers, 1,000 men, 2 ships, and literally no air force to speak of. To what we have today, it's really been due to 2 main factors. One, we have had dedicated and committed commanders and servicemen, NS men, with very strong leadership and with a clear vision and resolve that we needed to build a very capable SAF for our own defense needs. The second reason, just as important, so the first reason is people. The second reason is that we had steady and committed investments to modernize the SAF for our defense needs. I'll talk about that later. So if we take stock and say, well, nearly after half a century of nation building and SAF building, what we have achieved, I think we have come a long way. But despite what we have attained today, I want to say that we remain vulnerable. Singapore remains vulnerable. And in terms of our vulnerability, I just want to say 2 things. One is that we are vulnerable because no matter what we do, or no matter what happens, we'll always be small geographically and in size, both in population and and landmass. In military terms, what people say is we lack strategic depth, which means that we are a very small island and we don't have a hinterland to retreat back to. We lack strategic depth, and that cannot change. The second reason we are vulnerable, we remain vulnerable, is because we have more to protect. If you study history, the unfortunate truth is that history teaches us that small, rich nations that cannot defend their own interests will be overtaken. It's a truism, and it's happened from time to time again in recent history. If you look up, the most recent one, of course, was Iraqi invasion over Kuwait, if you remember. Small, rich oil state. So, if you cannot defend your own interests, you risk being overtaken. So, I want to move on to say, starting from where we are today, how then do we progress as the SAF? We've come a long way. We know our vulnerabilities and challenges. And I want to sketch what the challenge will be for the next 2 decades in terms of our defense and security. We've said that the reason why SAF has progressed and modernized so well is because of continued investments over a protracted period. And that's been our philosophy for defense investments. We spend steadily. So when the economy picks up, we don't overspend, but neither do we cut back drastically when we don't have economic growth. Basically, because of that philosophy, we've been able to modernize rapidly in relation to other countries. The SAF has been able to modernize, not only modernize, but in relation to other countries, we've actually either caught up or stretched the gap in terms of other militaries. But let me explain why the scenario is shifting. And I'll give you some figures. Just 2 examples. Let me first quote from a fairly authoritative source, Jane Defense again. If you look at worldwide aggregate, how much all countries spend on their defense and security needs, it's about 1.6 trillion US dollars. Now, a decade ago, if you take 3 large chunks, who spends what? US spends almost 35 to 40% of all the aggregated spending, $1.6 trillion. Europe, EU, including the UK, spend about another third, about 29%, 30%. So US spend a large chunk, 35 to 40%. EU and UK spend about 29%. And then the rest of the world, another 30%. But the next decade, or the next 2 decades, even starting from now, if you look, just monitor the news, because after the global financial crisis, and of course in EU they say they want to reap the peace dividends after the Cold War. There is and will continue to be a drastic reduction in defense spending in America and EU. But the total spending across the world is expected to remain the same. Why? 2 real reasons. 2 significant reasons. Who is going to spend more are the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and to a smaller extent, ASEAN nations. The reason is that as the economic focus shifts across to the Pacific, if you observe what happens when countries or nations get wealthier, they also want to pay attention to their defense needs, and they want to modernize their forces. They realize that there's new equipment, they have to upgrade their people. You can't be operating, the last generation radar, the sonars, your platforms, and if you find other people, you have to modernize it. So across Asia, there's a vast movement to modernize your militaries. So I've given you in percentage terms, but let me give you another cut in terms of dollar terms. We'll circulate this as I said. So Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, is one of these think tanks. So when they look at defense spending, when they looked at just Asia Pacific, the defense spending in Asia Pacific has more than doubled compared to 1990 after the Berlin Wall fell. From 1989 to 2009, it increased from US 125 billion to 275 billion, almost double. In contrast, European defense spending fell by more than 40% over the same period, and US fell from about 700 to 400 over billion. And looking at the NICs, compared to the last decade, for Southeast Asia and East Asian regions, both for East Asia, which means China, North Korea, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, the defense spending is expected to go up by about 60 to 70%. Went up from about 60 to 70% 2001 to 2010. You can refer to the figures later. So against this backdrop, where your economic focus changes, shifts towards the Pacific nations, especially Asia, other countries are modernizing their forces. If you look at our defense policy, we were very wise to continue to spend steadily over the last 2 decades, because that allowed us to just steadily build up. But as we see other countries modernize their air force, we will just keep a steady pace, continue what we've done. We will maintain our policy of investing steadily in defense, with no sharp increases during an economic upturn, neither a sharp decrease when the economy slows. And overall, this approach has served us well and will continue it. And I'll give you practical reasons why this is a very prudent policy. I'll explain to you in practical terms so that Singaporeans can understand. I also want to touch, before I talk about practical examples, why it's important to keep this investments not only in terms of commitment but our investment. I also want to touch on, apart from the shifts in the focus in the external environment, why we can never be assured that the external environment around us will always be benign. And I'll give you large forces which are changing so that, again, Singaporeans can understand, because we are a small country, a little red dot, and sometimes we look at ourselves and we forget that there's a much bigger world out there, and the tectonic plates, they say, are shifting, and as a small country you can be easily, or in a small boat in a large ocean, when the waves become very unsettled, small boats can really be buffeted. First of all, if you look at how the working age population has changed, it's increased by about 40% in the last 20 years. And Asia has accounted for 2/3 of that working age population. In terms even of demography, in terms of where people are, is shifting towards Asia Pacific. If you look at the Northern Hemisphere, they're aging, they're declining. The numbers in the BRIC countries, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, are going up. So demography is what we call a very powerful force. People, just where they are, how they settle, what the movements are, the age. So for people, there's a shift.